It was supposed to be an ordinary evening, dinner, music, and a quiet night at home. I had set everything up, candles on the table, wine glasses polished and ready. My girlfriend was on her way, and I could almost hear her familiar laugh as I imagined our night unfolding. The doorbell rang earlier than expected. I smiled, thinking she'd surprised me. But when I opened the door, the evening cracked like thin glass. It wasn't her. Instead, she stood there, my mom's best friend. Her hair was slightly messy, her jacket wrinkled, like she'd been walking aimlessly for hours. There was a quiet fragility in her expression that made me pause. She wasn't supposed to look like this, so uncertain, almost lost. She stepped inside without a word when I opened the door wider. I didn't stop her. I wasn't even sure why. The air shifted as she crossed the room, like something unspoken came in with her. She moved toward the couch and sat slowly, as if gravity weighed heavier on her tonight. I stayed by the door for a second longer than I should have, trying to figure out what this was. I walked over and sat across from her, the hum of the music suddenly too loud. Her eyes stayed on the floor, her breathing shallow but steady. I noticed the faint tremor in her hand when she rested it on her knee. She didn't need to say what had happened. I'd seen enough heartbreak to recognize the signs. In silence, I stood and went to the kitchen. The kettle's soft hum filled the void. I grabbed a mug and added a tea bag before the whistle broke the stillness. When I returned, she took the cup, holding it between her hands like it was the only warmth she'd felt in a long time. Minutes passed. The room felt heavier with each second, the kind of quiet that didn't need to be interrupted by words. I noticed how tightly she gripped the mug, like she was grounding herself. Her usually perfect posture was gone. Instead, she leaned forward, shoulders hunched slightly inward, trying to shrink away from whatever had hurt her. There was no dramatic outburst, no flood of emotion, just a quiet unraveling. And somehow, that made it worse. The clock on the wall ticked, unnoticed until now. I glanced at the time and realized my girlfriend would be here any minute. The knock came, sharp and sudden, cutting through the stillness. I stood, heart racing. She didn't look up as I walked toward the door. The night had shifted yet again, and I wasn't sure how it would end. I reached for the doorknob, my pulse hammering in my ears. The knock felt louder than it should have, like a countdown. I opened the door slowly, bracing myself. She stood there, smiling, holding a small bag of takeout and a bottle of wine, completely unaware of the quiet storm brewing behind me. Her eyes lit up when she saw me, and she leaned in for a quick kiss on the cheek. The scent of her familiar perfume washed over me, but my mind stayed tethered to the living room. "Surprise," she said brightly, holding up the bag. I nodded, stepping aside to let her in. She walked past me, humming softly, completely at ease. I closed the door behind her, swallowing hard. She wasn't supposed to see this. But she did. Her steps faltered the moment she saw the figure on the couch. The shift in the room was immediate, a sharp, unspoken shift that felt like a fault line cracking beneath our feet. She didn't ask any questions. She just froze. The bag of food in her hand lowered slightly, and I could see the confusion tightening across her face like a shadow. She stopped by unexpectedly, I said quickly, the words heavier than I wanted them to be. Still, no one moved. The two women barely looked at each other. One was too proud to show weakness in front of a stranger, and the other too blindsided to know how to react. Finally, my mom's friend placed her mug down on the table with deliberate care. The soft clink was louder than it should have been. She stood, smoothing her jacket as though trying to pull herself back together, piece by piece. "I should go," she said. "No, you don't have to," I muttered instinctively. But even I knew how hollow that sounded. She looked past me, giving a small, tight nod before heading toward the door. I watched her leave, and she didn't look back. The door closed with a muted thud that seemed to echo in my chest. For a second, everything felt suspended, like even the air didn't know what to do. My girlfriend placed the bag on the counter. I could feel her eyes on me, studying me the way she always did when something didn't add up. She didn't explode. She didn't accuse. That wasn't her style. Instead, she took a slow breath and asked, "Is everything okay?" That simple question hit harder than any accusation ever could. I forced a nod. She just needed someone to talk to? She didn't say anything at first. Her silence felt worse than words. She walked past me, setting out the food and arranging the plates the way she always did, methodically, as if order could smooth out the cracks. We sat down, and the table between us felt like a mile-wide canyon. I watched her pour the wine and take a slow sip before finally meeting my eyes. "You sure you're okay?" she asked again. The second time was softer, almost like she was trying to convince herself more than me. I nodded again, but it felt like I was trying to hold back an ocean with a paper wall. We ate in near silence, the clinking of forks and glasses the only sound in the room. I tried to focus on the food, but every bite felt heavy. After a while, she reached for my hand across the table. Her fingers were warm, familiar. I felt the steady rhythm of her pulse against my skin, like she was trying to anchor me. "It's okay," she said quietly. But it wasn't. I felt the weight of everything I hadn't said pressing down like lead in my chest. I didn't know if she could sense the cracks forming, but she tried to hold the moment together with that simple gesture. We finished dinner, cleaned up the plates, and curled up on the couch with the TV playing quietly in the background. She rested her head against my shoulder like she always did. On the surface, it looked like everything was fine. But beneath it, something had shifted, something I couldn't put back into place. She dozed off after a while, her breathing steady and calm. I watched the rise and fall of her chest, feeling like a stranger in my own life. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. I reached for it cautiously, heart thudding. A new message lit up the screen. A single sentence from her. "Thank you for listening tonight." I stared at it for a long time. My girlfriend stirred in her sleep, her fingers still laced loosely with mine. I put the phone down and exhaled, but the knot in my chest only tightened. Some storms don't come with thunder. Some just settle quietly, waiting for the right moment to break. The next morning felt almost normal. Almost. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting soft streaks across the room. My girlfriend was still asleep, curled up on the couch under a throw blanket. The TV was frozen on a paused movie scene we never really watched. I stood in the kitchen, making coffee, listening to the quiet hum of the machine. My phone sat nearby, blank and dark. I hadn't replied to the message from last night. I wasn't sure I should. The smell of coffee drifted through the room as I poured 2 mugs, adding the right amount of cream to hers. I heard the soft rustle of fabric as she woke, stretching with a sleepy yawn. "Morning," she murmured, rubbing her eyes as she shuffled toward me. Her smile was warm, familiar. She kissed my cheek, took the mug from my hands, and sipped slowly. Everything she did felt routine, yet I couldn't shake the weight in my chest. I forced a smile in return, hoping it looked real enough. We spent the morning together, breakfast, small talk about her plans for the day, and some light teasing about how I always burn toast. But beneath the surface, my mind was somewhere else entirely. She left by mid-morning, waving from the door as she headed out to meet friends. The moment the door clicked shut behind her, the silence came rushing back like a wave. And that's when it happened. The doorbell rang again. I knew before I even reached it who was standing on the other side. I hesitated for a second, staring at the door as if opening it would change everything. Then I exhaled and pulled it open. There she was. She looked different, calmer, more collected, but there was still something in her eyes that made my chest tighten. She wore a casual jacket over a fitted blouse, her hair neatly pulled back. But I could tell she'd spent too much time making herself look fine. She gave a faint, apologetic smile, the kind people give when they're not sure they should be somewhere. "I wasn't planning to come back," she said quietly. I stepped aside, and she walked in without waiting for an invitation. The room still smelled faintly of coffee, and the couch was still warm from where my girlfriend had slept. Everything felt too close, too raw. She turned to face me, crossing her arms like she was trying to hold herself together. "I shouldn't be here," she started, but the words trailed off. She was still standing close to the door, like part of her was ready to leave. I didn't move. The space between us felt heavy. She glanced toward the couch, the half-empty mug of coffee, the blanket draped over the armrest. Her gaze softened, and for a second, something flickered in her expression. Sadness, maybe regret. But it was too late to undo anything. You didn't reply, she said, looking back at me. I didn't know what to say. That much was true. She nodded as though she expected that answer. Then she stepped forward, slowly closing the distance. She wasn't hesitant this time. She wasn't crumbling or uncertain. She was resolute. I should have stopped her. I knew that. But I didn't. When she reached me, her hand brushed mine, just a small, fleeting touch that sent a shock through me. She looked up, her eyes searching mine for something unspoken. The quiet stretch thin between us, fragile but unbreakable. And then, before I could process what was happening, she leaned in. The warmth of her breath, the faint scent of her perfume, it all blurred together as she pressed her lips against mine. It wasn't hurried or desperate. It was soft and deliberate, the kind of kiss that steals the air from your lungs because you're too caught up to breathe. But in the back of my mind, alarms were going off, telling me this was wrong. That I couldn't let this happen. I pulled back, stepping away. Her expression stayed calm, though her eyes betrayed something deeper, something raw. I'm sorry, I muttered, though I wasn't sure if I was apologizing to her, to myself, or to someone else entirely. She looked down, exhaled slowly, and nodded. She didn't argue, didn't beg for an explanation. She just stood there for a moment longer, then turned and walked out the door without another word. The room felt colder as soon as she was gone. I pressed my hands against my face, trying to shake off the weight of what had just happened. But I knew the truth, no matter how hard I tried to bury it. The line had been crossed. There was no going back. I stayed in the living room longer than I should have, staring blankly at the door as if expecting her to walk back in. The air felt stale, heavy with everything unsaid. The soft hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the apartment, filling the silence like static in my mind. Eventually, I moved to the kitchen and started cleaning up, anything to occupy my hands, to drown out the nagging thoughts in my head. The coffee mug she'd held still sat on the counter. I picked it up, rinsed it under hot water, and scrubbed it harder than necessary until it was spotless, but no matter how clean the mug was, the feeling of what had happened clung to me. By the time the early afternoon sunlight stretched across the floor, I forced myself to leave the apartment. I needed air, anything but those four walls that felt smaller with each passing minute. The streets were busy in that lazy weekend way, families walking to brunch, couples holding hands, kids laughing as they rode scooters past slow-moving tourists. I drifted aimlessly through it all, feeling like an outsider watching someone else's life. I ended up at a small cafe a few blocks away, the one my girlfriend and I always went to. The smell of fresh bread and coffee should have felt comforting, but instead, it reminded me of how fragile things had become. I ordered a coffee and sat at an outdoor table, staring blankly at the street. My phone buzzed in my pocket, pulling me out of my daze. I pulled it out, already knowing who it was. Her name lit up the screen. My girlfriend. I hesitated before answering. "Hey," I said, trying to sound normal. Her voice was bright, full of energy. She told me about her morning, how good it felt to catch up with her friends. She mentioned a bakery they'd stopped at and how she'd brought back something sweet for us to share later. Every word felt like a reminder of how much I was betraying her by not telling her the truth. "I can't wait to see you tonight," she said before hanging up. "Love you." I forced the words out. "Love you too." I hung up and stared at my reflection in the cafe window. I barely recognized myself, the same face but different eyes. Distant. Caught in a mess I'd created but didn't know how to untangle, I spent another hour at the cafe, trying to convince myself that I could move past it. Pretend it never happened. People make mistakes. One wrong moment doesn't have to define you forever. That's what I told myself. Over and over. When I finally walked home, I felt calmer, at least on the surface. I stepped into the apartment, and for a moment, everything seemed normal again. I put the coffee cup in the sink, grabbed the TV remote, and let the mindless noise fill the room. Minutes later, the sound of a key turning in the lock made me sit up straighter. The door opened, and there she was, my girlfriend, smiling as she stepped inside, holding a small bakery box. She kicked off her shoes and walked over, planting a soft kiss on my cheek as if nothing had changed. The scent of sugar and cinnamon followed her, warm and comforting. She placed the box on the table and opened it, revealing a row of perfectly frosted pastries. "I got your favorite," she said, proud of herself. "Thought it'd make your day better." The weight of her kindness was unbearable. I nodded, trying to smile, but it felt hollow. She sat beside me, resting her head on my shoulder, content in the quiet. I watched her out of the corner of my eye, the way her hair fell over her cheek, the way she absent-mindedly traced the edge of the pastry box. She deserved so much better than what I was giving her. As we sat there, I realized that pretending things were fine wouldn't make them fine. I couldn't just wipe the slate clean. But I wasn't ready to admit everything either. Not yet. So, I sat there, frozen between two worlds, the one I'd built with her and the one I'd ruined in a moment of weakness. For now, I chose silence. But I knew it wouldn't last. By the time evening settled in, the apartment felt warmer, cozier. The smell of pastries lingered in the air, and the glow from the table lamp cast a soft light over the room. It was the kind of night where everything should have felt perfect. She was curled up next to me on the couch, her legs tucked under a blanket, scrolling through her phone. Her presence was comforting and familiar, but I couldn't relax. The weight of what I'd done sat heavy on my chest, tightening every breath. I focused on the muted television, though I wasn't really watching. I was too aware of her laughter when she read something funny, the way she absent-mindedly leaned into me like she always did. At one point, she set her phone down and looked at me. "You've been quiet today." It wasn't an accusation, it was just an observation. But her words hit harder than I expected. I forced a small smile, hoping it would be enough. "Just tired?" She didn't press. That was one of the things I loved about her. She never pushed me when I needed space. Instead, she wrapped her arms around me and rested her head against my chest, as if trying to remind me of everything solid between us. I felt my pulse quicken, but not for the right reasons. I should have felt lucky to have her, to be here, grounded by her presence. But instead, I felt trapped in my own guilt, like a liar who'd wandered too far into his story to find his way back. At some point, she shifted, pulling me back to the present. "Hey," she said softly, "I brought dessert, and you haven't even touched it?" Her eyes were warm, playful. She nudged the box closer to me, trying to lighten the mood. I reached for one of the pastries, took a bite, and forced myself to focus on the sweetness, hoping it would ground me. She smiled, satisfied that she'd gotten me to relax, even if it was only for a second. She leaned in, brushing a kiss against my cheek, soft and lingering. I turned slightly, meeting her halfway. Her lips found mine, familiar and warm, reminding me of everything I was trying to hold on to. But guilt tasted bitter, even in moments like this. When she pulled away, she gave me a look, a quiet question in her eyes. I could tell she sensed something was wrong, even if she didn't have the words for it. I reached for her hand, squeezing it gently, hoping she wouldn't see through me. "I'm lucky to have you," I said, and it wasn't a lie. Her smile softened, and she settled back into the couch, content. But I wasn't content. I couldn't be. The hours passed slowly, the minutes dragging like weights tied to my ankles. We finished the movie, though I couldn't recall a single scene. The room quieted as she drifted off, her breathing even and peaceful. I sat there for a while, listening to the soft hum of the night. The apartment felt too still, like it was holding its breath. My phone buzzed on the table, lighting up the darkness. I stared at the screen, at the message preview. It was short, too short. "I shouldn't have come." The words felt like a punch to the chest. I locked the screen quickly, as if hiding it would make it disappear. But it didn't. I looked down at my girlfriend, still asleep against my shoulder. Her trust in me was quiet, unspoken, yet it pressed down harder than anything else. I leaned my head back against the couch and closed my eyes, trying to push the world away. But all I could see was the growing distance between who I was supposed to be and who I'd become. The lies were multiplying, each one building on the last. And with each passing moment, I was losing the one thing I couldn't afford to lose, her. But the worst part wasn't the fear of being caught. The worst part was knowing that I'd already betrayed everything that mattered, and no amount of silence could fix it. The next morning felt like waking up in a fog. The early light filtered through the curtains, soft and gray, and for a moment, I forgot where I was. Then I felt her shift beside me, the warmth of her hand still resting on mine. She was already awake, scrolling through her phone, her face peaceful in that half-asleep way that comes after a slow morning. "Morning," she murmured without looking up, her voice soft and familiar. I forced a quiet morning back and slipped out of bed, telling myself I just needed some coffee to clear my head. But even the normalcy of boiling water and the scent of freshly ground beans couldn't drown out the noise in my mind. I stared at the steam rising from the mug and tried to focus on the small details, the sound of water dripping, the hum of the fridge, but none of it could quiet the pull in my chest. The message from last night was still stuck in my head. I shouldn't have come. I could almost hear her voice in the silence, filled with regret I didn't know how to process. My girlfriend walked into the kitchen, wrapping her arms around my waist from behind, her cheek pressing lightly against my back. The touch was warm, grounding, but it didn't ease the tightness in my ribs. "You okay?" she asked, her voice steady but curious. I nodded quickly, afraid of what might slip out if I didn't. "Just tired." She didn't push, she never did. She let me be, kissing my shoulder lightly before pouring herself a glass of juice. It was such a small, simple moment, but it made me feel like I was suffocating. She deserved to know, didn't she? But how do you ruin someone's morning like that? We went through the motions of the morning, brushing our teeth, making plans for the day, exchanging small smiles that felt forced on my end but real on hers. Then, just as we were finishing breakfast, her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at it and made a small face. "Mom's friend wants to stop by later," she said casually, sipping her coffee. "She left something here last week and asked if it'd be okay." The words hit like a freight train. My breath caught in my chest, and I scrambled to keep my expression neutral. "Is that okay?" she asked, glancing up. I nodded too quickly. "Yeah, of course." The rest of the morning dragged. I could barely focus on anything she was saying. Every small sound, every knock, every step in the hallway outside, made me flinch. When she finally left to run errands, the apartment grew still again, the kind of silence that made your thoughts louder. Hours passed, and I tried to keep myself busy. I cleaned the countertops, folded laundry, anything to keep my hands moving. But when the doorbell rang, the sound felt deafening. I stood there for a moment, frozen. Part of me wanted to pretend I wasn't home, to ignore it and hope it would go away. But that was a lie too, wasn't it? I walked slowly to the door and opened it. There she was. Her face was calm but guarded, her hands tucked into her jacket pockets. She didn't say anything at first, and neither did I. We just stood there, locked in a silent moment that felt heavier than words. "I didn't mean to complicate things," she said finally, her voice low. I nodded, unsure of how to respond. My pulse thrummed in my ears. She stepped inside carefully, like she wasn't sure if she belonged there. The air shifted again, just like it had the last time. She glanced around the room, the neatly folded blanket, the empty mugs on the table, then back at me. "I came to get what I left," she said quietly, as if that was the only reason she was here. But we both knew it wasn't. I pointed to the small bag sitting near the bookshelf. It had been there for days, unnoticed until now. She walked over, picked it up, and held it for a moment before turning back to me. "I shouldn't have sent that message," she said, her eyes meeting mine. I felt like I needed to explain." Her words hung in the air, heavy and unfinished. I knew what she meant. She wasn't talking about the message. She was talking about everything. "You don't have to explain," I said quietly, though I wasn't sure if I believed that. She stepped closer, and for a second, the room seemed to shrink. Her gaze softened, and for a split second, I could see the same confusion in her eyes that I felt in my own. "I didn't come here to make things harder," she said. But the space between us felt dangerous, fragile, as though it could shatter if either of us moved too fast. She exhaled slowly, glancing toward the door. "I should go." I nodded, though every part of me felt tied to the floor. She reached for the doorknob, pausing briefly before turning it. As the door opened, she glanced back, giving me a faint, almost apologetic smile. And then she was gone. The door clicked shut, but the noise lingered like an echo. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful, it was suffocating. The apartment felt heavier after she left. I stood there, staring at the closed door, listening to the hum of the world outside, muffled conversations, footsteps in the hallway, a distant door slamming. Life moved on, but I couldn't. I walked back into the living room and sat on the couch, running a hand over my face. My chest felt tight, my mind spinning with everything unsaid, everything I couldn't undo. The weight of it all pressed down, relentless. The bag she'd taken was gone, but her presence still lingered, like a faint scent that refused to fade. I closed my eyes and leaned back, trying to slow my thoughts. But every second only made things worse. Memories I hadn't asked for resurfaced, the softness of her touch, the way she'd looked at me, the moment I let the line blur. The guilt was overwhelming, coiling in my stomach like a sickness. No matter how I tried to justify it, no matter how small I told myself that moment was, it had grown into something I couldn't contain. I needed to move. Sitting there felt like drowning in quicksand. I grabbed my keys and jacket, heading for the door without a second thought. The air outside was cold, sharp against my skin. The sky was overcast, dull and gray, matching the numbness in my chest. I walked without direction, past familiar streets and quiet cafes. The city buzzed around me, cars, conversations, the distant sound of music from an open window, but it all felt disconnected, like I was moving through a movie scene, not real life. That I stopped at a park bench near the corner of a street, watching people pass by. A couple walked hand in hand, laughing softly. A boy chased after a dog, his laughter bright and innocent. I envied their simplicity, their unburdened lives. I thought of her again. Not my mom's friend, my girlfriend. Her face flashed in my mind, her warmth, the way she always trusted me without hesitation. She deserved so much more than what I'd given her. But how do you explain to someone that the version of you they love isn't real anymore? That you fractured into something they wouldn't recognize? The cold seeped through my jacket, but I didn't move. My mind kept circling the same questions, the same fears. I'd ruined everything, and the worst part was that I couldn't take any of it back. I don't know how long I sat there, long enough for the streetlights to flicker on. The sky had turned a muted blue, shadows stretching across the sidewalk. I finally stood, shaking off the numbness in my legs. When I got home, the apartment was dark except for the faint glow of the kitchen light. The emptiness was louder than anything else. The silence felt like a punishment, wrapping around me tighter with every step. I kicked off my shoes and sank onto the couch, staring blankly at the ceiling. Time passed, unmarked and slow. At some point, I heard the front door unlock. She was home. Her footsteps were soft, familiar, and steady. She walked into the living room, setting her bag on the table. I didn't turn my head, I couldn't. I felt her presence as she paused behind me, like she was trying to read the air, sensing something was off. But she didn't ask questions. Instead, she walked into the kitchen, poured herself some water, and moved through the space like everything was normal. But nothing was normal anymore. She sat down next to me, her movements slow and comfortable. The couch shifted slightly under her weight. I kept my eyes on the ceiling, barely breathing. She reached for my hand, her fingers soft against mine. The gesture was simple, instinctive. She thought I was just tired, stressed from the week, maybe lost in my own thoughts. I wanted to tell her everything right then. The words clawed at the back of my throat, desperate to escape. But I stayed silent, paralyzed by the weight of what that truth would do to her, to us. She leaned her head against my shoulder, her breathing steady and calm. I sat there, motionless, feeling like a stranger in my own life. Minutes passed. Maybe hours. I wasn't sure. The guilt pressed deeper, suffocating me from the inside out. I couldn't hide in this silence forever. I knew that sooner or later, the truth would tear everything apart. But for now, I stayed still, trapped between the life I had and the life I'd destroyed. The apartment felt unusually still. The faint ticking of the clock filled the room as I sat at the table, staring at the place settings I had carefully prepared. 2 wine glasses, cloth napkins folded neatly, and a small vase with fresh flowers. Everything was ready. Except she wasn't here. My girlfriend was late, really late. No call, no text. I checked my phone again, the empty screen casting a faint blue glow. The minutes dragged by, each one making the silence around me heavier. I tried to shake off the creeping unease. Maybe she was caught up in traffic. Maybe her phone had died. I ran through a dozen explanations, but none of them eased the tight knot in my chest. Then the doorbell rang. Finally. I exhaled, relieved, and hurried to the door, already rehearsing the playful, "What took you so long?" line in my head. But when I swung the door open, it wasn't her. It was my mom's friend. She stood there holding a covered dish, her face warm with a familiar, easy smile. The faint smell of cinnamon and baked apples drifted in with her. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said, her voice light but careful. "I heard from your mom that you were having a quiet evening. I thought you might like some company, or at least some dessert." My stomach twisted, not with nerves, but with something else entirely. For a moment, I wasn't sure what to do. The table was set for two, but seeing her standing there, holding a freshly baked pie, somehow made the room feel less empty. "Come in," I said before I could second-guess myself. She stepped inside, taking off her coat and placing the warm pie dish on the table. The sweet aroma filled the room instantly, cozier than any candle I could have lit. "I didn't mean to barge in," she said, glancing at the table settings. "I just figured, well, sometimes plans change." I shrugged, giving her a faint smile. "She's running late?" Her eyes softened as she looked at me. She knew what I didn't want to say out loud, that the waiting felt longer because of the silence. She pulled out a chair and sat down. I joined her, still unsure how the night had shifted so quickly. She cut 2 slices of pie, sliding one onto my plate with a quiet, practiced ease. I picked up my fork, took a bite, and felt an unexpected warmth spread through me. It wasn't just good, it was amazing. The crust was buttery and crisp, the filling sweet but not overpowering. Better than anything I'd had in a long time. "Wow," I muttered without thinking. She laughed softly, brushing a stray hair behind her ear. We sat there for a while, eating in companionable silence. It was strange, how the room felt different with her here. Less about the anticipation of romance, more about the comfort of familiarity. She poured us both some water, and I caught myself watching her movements, the calm, deliberate way she folded her napkin, the way she held her glass. Everything about her was effortless, like she belonged in this moment, filling the quiet that had been gnawing at me all evening. She leaned back slightly, her eyes drifting toward the window. "I always liked nights like this," she said quietly, almost to herself. "Simple. No noise. Just being." I nodded, unsure if I should respond or just let the moment linger. In another life, this could have been exactly what I'd wanted. An evening without expectations or pretense. No overthinking. No pressure. Just quiet conversation and warmth. But this wasn't that life. The weight of reality pressed down harder. My girlfriend was still out there somewhere, unaware of the shift that had happened here. And I didn't know how to piece it all back together once she walked through the door. I finished my slice of pie and set my fork down, feeling more full than I had in weeks, but not just from the food. "Thank you," I said, my voice low but sincere. She gave me a soft smile, like she understood something I couldn't quite name. The kind of understanding that wasn't loud or showy, it just was. I checked the time again. Another hour had passed, and still no word. The unease returned, but this time it wasn't as sharp. Eventually, she stood and began gathering her things. The evening had stretched out longer than either of us had planned, but she didn't make it feel awkward. "I should get going," she said, her voice steady but warm. I walked her to the door. She paused for a second, her eyes meeting mine in the dim hallway light. "Take care," she said softly, then stepped out into the cool night air. The door clicked shut behind her, and the apartment felt emptier than before. The warmth from the pie still lingered, but it wasn't enough to quiet the ache in my chest. I sat back down, staring at the untouched glass of wine on the table. The night had slipped through my fingers, turning into something I hadn't expected. The clock ticked on, and the apartment felt quieter, lonelier. And all I could think was how much things had changed, and how I'd let it happen. The apartment was suffocating in its silence. I sat at the table, staring at the neatly folded napkin by my plate, the crumbs of pie scattered like remnants of a life I was trying to keep together. The warmth from earlier had disappeared, leaving only the cold residue of time wasted on regret. The minutes felt like hours. The quiet pressed in on me as I waited, still clinging to the faint hope that when she walked through that door, everything would somehow reset. But hope wasn't enough. When the door finally opened, my heart lurched. She stepped inside, slowly, as if testing the air. Her hair was windswept from the cold, her coat draped over one arm. She didn't look at me as she placed her bag on the counter and filled a glass of water at the sink. I watched her every movement, waiting for the familiar ease to return between us. But it didn't. The clink of the glass as she set it down felt louder than it should have been. Her eyes drifted toward the table, to the plates, the half-full wine glass, and the pie dish. She froze for a second, just long enough for me to notice. I stayed seated, trying not to move, like stillness could somehow make me invisible. She didn't ask why there were two settings. She didn't need to. Her expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable. She wasn't angry. She wasn't sad. She was processing. Her fingers brushed over the edge of the table, tracing the rim of the glass. She didn't look at me. The weight of the room settled deeper. She pulled out a chair and sat, the chair legs scraping softly against the floor. The way she folded her hands, resting them lightly on the table, felt too composed, like she was holding everything together by sheer willpower. I could feel her exhaustion. It wasn't the kind that sleep could fix. The sound of the clock ticked through the silence. I waited for her to speak, but she didn't. Instead, she leaned back slightly, staring at the faint reflection in the window. A knot twisted in my chest as I watched her sit there, quiet, withdrawn. She stayed like that for a while, minutes, maybe longer. Then, without a word, she stood and walked toward the hallway. Her steps were soft, deliberate. She paused briefly near the bedroom door before disappearing inside. The door closed with a soft click. I didn't follow her. I stayed at the table, staring at the empty chair across from me. The food was cold now, untouched except for the slice of pie she hadn't eaten. The apartment felt like a crime scene, ordinary things left behind in the aftermath of something unseen but undeniable. The truth had finally settled between us, unspoken but loud enough to echo in the spaces we used to fill with trust. The damage was done. The apartment was dark, save for the faint glow of the street lamp outside. I sat motionless, staring at the spot where she'd stood before walking out the door. Minutes passed, maybe hours. It didn't matter anymore. Time had become irrelevant. I leaned back, trying to steady my breathing, but my thoughts were relentless. I replayed every choice I'd made, every second that led to this moment. Regret twisted inside me, sharp and unforgiving. I had lost her, and the weight of that truth settled like cold steel in my chest. Then, out of nowhere, the doorbell rang. The sound jolted me upright, my pulse spiking in confusion. I stared at the door, unsure if I'd imagined it. But then it rang again, softer this time, as if whoever was on the other side was hesitant. I stood slowly, my legs heavy and unsteady. I wasn't sure what I was expecting. Her? A neighbor? A mistake? My mind raced through every possibility as I reached for the doorknob and turned it. The door swung open, and there she was. Her face was pale in the dim light, her expression unreadable. She wasn't holding her bag or her coat. She just stood there, her eyes locked on mine, as if trying to decide if she'd made the right choice. Before I could say anything, she stepped inside and closed the door behind her. The small click of the latch echoed through the room. She crossed the space between us, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her. Her eyes searched mine, scanning for something, truth, regret, answers, maybe all of it. For a moment, I didn't breathe. Then, without warning, she reached out and took my hand in hers. The touch was soft, hesitant but deliberate. The same hands that had pulled away hours earlier now clung to mine like they didn't want to let go. She exhaled slowly, and in the silence that followed, I felt the tension release, like a taut string finally snapping back into place. I opened my mouth to speak, but she shook her head slightly, silencing me before the words could form. Her hand tightened around mine, and I understood. It wasn't about explanations or apologies, it was about what came next. I nodded, and a small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. The storm wasn't over, but for the first time, it felt like there was a clearing ahead. The room felt warmer now. Not because everything was fixed, it wasn't, but because for the first time in what felt like forever, we were standing together instead of apart. Sometimes, healing doesn't come from grand gestures or perfect endings. Sometimes, it starts with a simple choice: to stay. She stayed,